Well, good morning, everyone. Chris Ballard here, phoning into this webinar from our spacious office in Aurora, Ontario. We are all sheltering in place as you are. I wanted to thank you all for attending this webinar, this inaugural webinar, and it's our thought that every week we'll have a conversation with someone who is well known, prominent in the passive house building sector across Canada, someone that can teach us all something. So I thank you for being here. I want to acknowledge that these are very difficult times for all of us, very stressful times for all of us. So on behalf of Passive House Canada, I just want to sincerely say that we hope that you and your loved ones are safe and secure. And I know that together we will get through this and be stronger on the other side. So without further ado, what I need to do is to turn on my screen, which I think is this button right here, screen sharing. So there we are. We're showing the main screen, I am told. And I wanted to thank everybody again for joining us on this inaugural Building Conversations with myself, Chris Ballard, the CEO of Passive House Canada, and Scott Kennedy. Let's get the show underway. Thanks a lot. So some of the outcomes we wanted from today, we want to introduce you, and I'm not too sure how many folks are familiar with Passive House. So we're going to take a few minutes just to talk about Passive House. I want to talk a little bit about myself and introduce our guest, Scott Kennedy. Then we'll have our conversation with Scott. We'll take some questions, and then I want to give you a plug about what Passive House Canada is. So I have held many titles in my life. I have been a journalist, executive director of a consumer advocacy association. I've worked in public affairs. I was a town of Aurora councillor when I really started to awaken to the need to build ecologically friendly. And we tried to do that with a number of our buildings. Later on, I became a member of Ontario's provincial parliament, representing my area of Newmarket and Aurora. I was promoted to Minister of Housing and then later to Minister of Environment and Climate Change for Ontario. Those of you from Ontario are probably familiar with a little thing called Cap and Trade. That was a program that I helped to usher in. And I will say that while I am relatively new to the world of Passive House and Passive House Canada, my experience has utterly convinced me that this is the way we must build and retrofit. There are no excuses for doing anything less than the Passive House standard by any name, the standard. There's no excuse for greenwashing. And what I know is that Passive House construction means healthy, resilient, and lower GHG emitting buildings. And I love this little picture of this house that pops up here because folks sometimes think that Passive House is a European, specifically a German concept, but the picture on the screen here is of a house in Canada, Saskatchewan, actually. This is Saskatchewan Conservation House, built by a group of scientists led by a fellow by the name of Dr. Orr, a physicist, from 1977, when we had a really big oil crisis in Canada. For those of you who are of a certain age might remember that. And these scientists wanted to know if they could build a house that required very little energy. And this is really, Saskatchewan House really is the ancestor of modern passive house design around the world. When the European scientists came looking for examples, this is one they came and visited, and Dr. Orr and his team were actually acknowledged by Passive House, the Passive House Institute that's housed in Germany, for their groundbreaking research and construction. A lot of the components on this building, Dr. Orr and his team had to build by hand. It was that advanced. This building is still being lived in today. It's still performing as good as the day it was built. So we can take some pride, those of us who are Canadians, that we were at the forefront of developing what is now known as the Passive House Building Standard. So welcome, Scott Kennedy. Scott is our first guest. Scott has been a principal of Cornerstone Architecture since 1988, and I know that he's committed to design strategies that minimize life cycle energy use. He is a professional engineer as well as a graduate of UBC School of Architecture. And I know Scott is well versed in the process of community consultation and public agency review. And I'm looking forward to some comments from him about how one moves passive house design through a municipality, a jurisdiction that maybe hasn't had experience with that before. Scott has headed his firm's architectural team for a wide array of residential, commercial, hotel, resort, office, public service upgrades. And I will say that Scott is a current director of Passive House Canada and a former chair of our organization. So be kind to me, folks, he's my boss. Moving along, what is a passive house? Well, a passive house is many things. It is a building standard. Foremost, it is a building standard. It is the most rigorous voluntary energy-based standard in the design and construction industry today. And this is worldwide acknowledged. Passive house standard assures that you will consume as much as 90% less heating and cooling energy than conventional buildings. It's a methodology. It's a way of designing buildings to achieve exceptional energy efficiency and superior thermal comfort. Heating and cooling loads are minimized through passive house design. And it really results in a healthy and resilient interior. And in these times, I think the emphasis on health and resiliency are really critical. Continuing on, what is a passive house? It's not passive, and it's not just for houses. The unfortunate translation, a literal translation from German passive house, and we know that that passive house in German means more than passive house in English. It's only, it's only passive only in that the building envelope does most of the work to maintain comfortable temperatures. And this, of course, permits a simpler, smaller mechanical system. It applies to both new and existing buildings. Some people are surprised to find out that Passive House has a retrofit standard. It's called EnerPHit, and the EnerPHit certification criteria, it provides a proven and financially viable methodology for deep energy retrofits. And for those of us who are looking at large urban settings filled with older buildings, one suspects that the major gains in GHG reductions will come through EnerPHit rather than new build adopting green standards. So the advantages of a passive house, and this will be the last blurb on this, and we'll get on to Scott. Super insulated building envelope, really high quality windows, a fantastic ventilation system with heat recovery, thermal bridge free, airtight. And you feel better when you live, work, and play in one of these buildings. There is year-round stable indoor air quality and temperature. They are very quiet and comfortable throughout all the seasons. There is a substantial reduction in energy use and operating costs, and it's very simple to use, and it's a very durable system, and it gives us all priceless peace of mind. So without further ado, Scott and I will turn our cameras on, and I will stop showing my screen, and we'll have a conversation with Scott. Are you ready, Scott? Here we go.
All set.
There we are. How is British Columbia? I forgot to mention in the introduction that you are a BC guy.
It is a beautiful sunny day here in Vancouver.
Very good.
Kind of spring, yeah.
I would tell you that it's a beautiful sunny day in Aurora here, except that I'd be lying. But I will take a dull, dreary, warm day over snow and slush, etc.
Right.
So, Scott, I have a number of questions, but I just wanted to have a casual conversation with you and have you impart some of your experience, some of your knowledge to folks who are listening in. And my first question is really simple. For Scott Kennedy, why Passive House? Why this standard?
Well, I guess that goes back, I don't know, maybe 6 years ago when we had been talking a lot about LEED. And while I believe LEED and a lot of these other standards were very good at raising awareness of green and environmental issues, I really felt they didn't emphasize energy conservation anywhere near enough. So I ended up taking an evening course with Guido Wimmers through the university and learning about Passive House. And at the time, I was designing the Heights, which is clearly the most famous building I'll do in my career because it took off after I convinced the owner and developer to do a Passive House building. And so it was really at that time the largest Passive House building in Canada. So it's like go big or go home. So we did an 85 suiters, our first project. And it's operating quite well. We've made a few mistakes. I think the biggest issue is overheating, and we're kind of learning that in these multis that overheating actually is the bigger challenge. Even in a climate like Vancouver's, which is really pretty conducive to Passive House, quite honestly. We've got, not too cold a winter, and we've got cool evenings and lots of good things. And I think you just have to be really careful and pay attention to do that. So really, that's where I got started. It's a target. It's a real standard. It's not greenwashing. It gives you the metrics and you got to hit them, and it tells you how to hit them. So that's kind of cool. Yeah.
Good. So I talked a little bit about in the intro, very briefly touched on some of the key positive benefits of Passive House building standards. But can you walk us through what you need to do as an architect coming from an engineering and architect background? What do you need to do to build to Passive House standards? What are those key elements that you need to watch?
Well, I think the first thing is you got to start. You got to actually decide you're going to do it, and maybe you got to do that a bit voluntarily on your own just to show your client that it's possible.
Yeah.
But you got to start, and you have to get some knowledge. So certainly taking the Passive House training courses is probably the very best way to do it. But there's lots of good books. There's lots of reading. There are books with details. There's lots of information on the web. So I'd say, get yourself a bit educated, and then the concepts are pretty logical, right? So the first thing is keep your form as compact as possible. That becomes really important in single family, much more important in single family townhouse type projects than in a big multi. You're already fairly compact in a big multi. You can expect significant more insulation. You have to use high quality windows and doors, triple glazed and maybe quad glazed in some of Northern Canada places with good frames. So the frames become really the weak point of the window once you get into triple glazing. You have to develop airtight details that the trades can actually execute. And you have to really think about well executed thermal bridge details. So from an architect, those thermal bridge details I think are the toughest part. Thicker walls, no big deal. Specking a bigger window, better windows, no big deal. Getting those thermal bridge details right is difficult, and making sure that you have a buildable airtight detail, those are the tough parts. And then after that, it's like careful placement of those windows, figuring out shading devices that actually work and actually deliver what you want to do, considering operable exterior shading. These are all decisions that should work. And then once you've kind of got your envelope done, you add an efficient heat recovery ventilation system. Typically, you want to locate that close to, the actual unit close to the exterior wall so that your duct runs, the cold duct runs through your envelope are quite small. Again, this is sort of northern climate stuff. you need a really well insulated and efficiently generated hot water system. And certainly today we're now moving to heat pumps to do that. And then you want an energy efficient appliances, just spec, induction cooking and heat pump dryers and charcoal filtered recirculation hood fans. It's sort of just put that equipment in. And then after that, you're going to make up that small additional energy required with an electric. To us, it's electric-based heating. I think you have to go there, but heat pump is the best. And you're trying to decarbonize your building. So that's really, to me, kind of the general approach as to how you do one. Yeah.
Right, good. So what can you tell me about energy modeling? I mean, I'm not an architect, I'm not an engineer, and at first, the passive house standards to me seemed a bit overwhelming. But having taken the introductory course and done a lot of reading, everything that passive house is about designing it right from the beginning and doing the energy modeling at the beginning, having a really good tradespeople and quality windows and doors, as you said. The only part I found intimidating, frankly, has been the energy modeling. And it may be that I haven't taken that class yet, but tell me about energy modeling. How important is that?
Well, it really is key. And, and like anybody, sometimes we get ahead of ourselves on the design and we should be doing a little energy modeling earlier. And sometimes that's because, we've made that mistake. Sometimes it's just because you've got so many municipal things demanding and you got timelines demanding and you don't have the capacity to get the energy model done as early as you like. There are lots of reasons why you don't do it as well as you should. But the key really is to start early. And certainly within the passive house world, the design PH, which is a SketchUp based envelope program, is a really good place to start. It does a good job of kind of getting that basic envelope form factor figured out. You can really see the difference between a compactness and what difference that makes in the insulation levels you have to work with, and trade off. You get a more compact building, you put more glass in it, that might be useful. So there are a lot of things that happen really at that early stage that are important. And remember that you should really start thinking about your thermal bridging details early, and that particularly on the ground plane. I think that's where the hardest details are. Ground plane and balconies, those are probably the hard ones, and overhangs. Those are really where you've got your problems that you got to figure out, both thermal bridging and your air tightness details. So you kind of have to be thinking about those as you go. And then you need to overlay that obviously with your mechanical systems and your allowances. So the hard part there is just making sure you've got proper areas to run your ducts and drop ceilings where you need them, or chases, or however you're going to run your ventilation system, and make sure you got large enough chases if you're doing a central system, that you've got a place to put the units and the ducts and all that stuff. So you layer that on after, but really it's the envelope that's the hard part. And well, I don't think the hard part. It's where you have to start with the passive house.
Is that envelope? And I was going to say, what is the standard for energy use in a passive home, a passive house building?
So there's really two metrics that are the heating side. There's 15 kilowatt hours per square meter per year annually.
Right.
And the square meter in a passive house is not the same square meter as it's not a gross square meter. It's what they call treated floor area, which is a net square meter. In other words, you don't even get to count the area of the interior partitions. You got to net them all out. So it's maybe 30% less than gross floor area. So that'll catch you if you don't get that right. And the other metric is 10 watts per square meter. I think that's right, 10 watts per square meter in terms of heating energy use. So this would be the power that your system has to put out on the coldest days of the winter. And in passive house, it's analyzed two ways. There's the algorithms look at a sunny cold day and they look at a cloudy less cold day, and you have to design to the worst one. And that really is where the standard came from, is that determines whether you in theory could use your ventilation air to heat your building, whether you can put enough heating energy in the ventilation air to actually heat your building. Not that we do that. We typically don't do that, but that's where the standard began, was the idea that can we just not have a particularly formal heating system, just use that little bit of air that we need to ventilate the building properly and make that enough to heat our building. So that's really where the standard came from.
Yeah, I know. I was talking to an architect a few months ago who's building a house for a couple. His concern, and they're building it in Ontario, Eastern Ontario, where winters can get chilly. And his concern was, or their concern was, that it was a relatively big home. And how were they going to heat it? His suggestion was they get themselves a couple of big dogs, and that would keep the house. It turns out he was serious. I thought he was joking, but just the heat that a human body gives off, and plus any big dogs you might have, can keep you primarily can heat the space you're in. Plus you're cooking and whatever else. So I have found that spectacular in terms of how low your energy usage is, and if you're in a province that uses hydroelectricity or green sources to create its energy, then topping up the heat in a house through electricity is very ecologically sound. And that's another one of the things that I love about Passive House, is that here in Ontario we've shut down a few years ago the last of the coal burning electrical production plants. So all of our energy in Ontario, well, actually about 96–97% of the energy in Ontario is classified as green. So I don't have to feel guilty now if I'm going to heat my house with electricity that I'm burning coal to do it. And in time, other provinces will come more and more on board with their green electrical standards as well. You talk about the envelope being primary to what's going on, and I'll take a step back. I have heard about interesting discussions and debates between architects and the energy modelers, as the energy modelers arm wrestle with the architects to change the look of the building to make it a little more energy efficient. So those are maybe that's a step that those in more traditional architectural practices haven't had to do as much of. I don't know if you want to comment on that, but I wanted you to talk about her comment on this building envelope, because I've heard a lot of interesting things about how difficult it can be to avoid thermal bridging and ruptures in the envelope. Any comments?
So two things. There's a major difference between a larger project like a big multifamily building and the way it fits into the standard, and the way a small single family house or duplex or something like that fits into the standard. And I happen to have firsthand knowledge because I'm doing my very first duplex right now. And the walls are significantly thicker than I would do on a multi. And in fact, the first multi we did, which was the Heights, we're actually doing multis now with much thinner walls because the walls are just much less important in a compact building like a multi, and overheating is the bigger issue there. Whereas in a small building in northern climates, it really is the heating energy that's the important piece. So, and of course, thermal bridging is a little easier to deal with in a single family house than it is to deal with that in a multi. The multi can give up a few bad details if it needs to, and typically we're finding where that is things like fire rated doors leading from vestibules into parkades and things like that. You can't get a good air seal on them, and they're terrible thermal performance, but they're in a part of the building, even though it's within the thermal envelope, it's not terribly sensitive, and you can kind of get away with it because you're more efficient elsewhere in your building. So there is some trade-offs and things like that that do occur part of the process in working out that envelope. But really the windows are important, and how you mount the windows are important because in a real northern building, we're going to over insulate those frames. In Vancouver, we're finding we don't need to do that. We can, we can perform fairly well without doing that. But the northern buildings we're doing, we're taking a lot of attention to how those windows are mounted. And we screwed up once because we kind of wiped out the ability to put screens on windows in a northern climate because we over insulated the frames too much, and we're still trying to correct that one. But we now have another northern project, 26 suites, and I only got a 600 amp single phase electrical service to do 26 suites. And so we're challenged there. We don't have enough power, and passive house is definitely going to be the answer, but we're probably looking at a pellet boiler or something like that just to get us through the winter. So that's actually current as of discussion tomorrow on that project.
Good, good. So the next thing I wanted to do, I was wondering if you can help me debunk some of the common myths that I encounter when I'm talking to people about passive house buildings. And you can comment on these or just give me a yes or no. So what I've heard people tell me is that passive house building is too complex. Is that true?
I would say no, they're not complex. Once you get a great building envelope in there, you are able to install typically very simple mechanical systems. They don't necessarily need a high degree of control. You're not trying to build energy efficient and move energy around really efficiently because you just don't need to. So I would say that they aren't very complicated in terms of their controls. At all. In fact, the ones we've done have very little controls in them, and I think they work fine. That being said, you do have to monitor them. There are the odd thing that doesn't, doesn't work properly, and it's hard to discover it. We found one where a couple of temperature sensors were just backwards, so they were measuring the wrong thing. But you didn't know that until the building hit the winter, and you couldn't understand why the preheaters were on and they shouldn't have been on, and that was the only way to discover it, was to actually see what the building's performing and try to figure out what was wrong. And so you do have to go back and monitor these things. It's very easy in any mechanical system to have a problem, but a building envelope, that's different. You get that air tightness test and you've done some good details, and you've got a good building right there. And then the problem is usually something like the window, adjusting the windows to seal properly, those kinds of things.
So the answer there is that it is not too complex. The other thing I've heard from a lot of people, and there's more and more research that I direct them to, but I hear from a lot of people that passive house building is too expensive. What's your experience?
So in the context of Toronto and Vancouver real estate, they're not expensive because the buildings, the construction cost is a very, very small portion of the cost. Now, when you get into northern climates where the land is not expensive and the construction cost is a significant part of a construction episode, it is more expensive, but the benefits are also much greater because the amount of energy saved is so much more significant and the comfort is so much higher. And I'm sitting here in my 1912 leaky old house. It's actually cold in my living room today, even though it's sunny outside. If we go up to these northern climates, when we did our passive house, we did one in Smithers, BC, which is northern climate. And during construction, this is a 19-suite building. It's pretty good size, 3 stories. And during construction, the people, once we got the envelope done, the trades were absolutely stunned, but they were basically working in there with their shirt sleeves, and the heating was, I think, 3 little 6x6 heaters heating the whole building, little electric heaters. And the contractor was stunned because he didn't have to put a bunch of winter heat into the place. It was very easy to heat. So they do perform. And at that point, they do perform. Yes, your client will probably choke at the price of the windows. But again, triple glazing is much more common on the prairies than it would be here in Vancouver. And I don't know about Toronto. I don't do much work out there, but
more common in Toronto. Yeah,
more common. So that jump isn't as big. And even in Vancouver, we're finding it's only 20%, even if you got a lousy frame. It's a 20% jump, and maybe it's not passive house certified. And I would say to people, get started. Even if you don't get a certified passive house building, if you use the principles and you get some triple glazing in, even if they're in bad frames, you're still building a good building, and maybe you can at least hit the low energy standard, which is 30 kilowatt hours per square meter per year, but still a very good building.
It's still a good building. So the last thing I've heard, and maybe you touched on it a little bit here, the other thing that I hear is that passive house standards are overkill. We really don't need to go to that high standard a level. You know, that's usually combined with it is this European / German plot to sell us doors and windows from Europe. We know that's not the truth because we have many door and window manufacturers opening up in Canada. But is passive house overkill?
Oh, this is always a tricky question for me. I would say that whatever you do, you might not agree with the metrics of passive house, but you have to agree with the principles of passive house. And that
Right.
passive house really is the foundation for every other energy standard that we would have, whether it's net zero, whatever that means. I don't know what that means. Whether it's FIAS, which is still a great standard. I mean, it's got a slightly different metrics than passive house, but it's the same principles. So I would say that the principles are important no matter what standard you're going to. And we can argue a little bit about whether, you know, it's cheaper to put solar panels on, but then get the last, you know, 5 kilowatt hours per square meter per year out of the building. But at the end of the day, you do have to recognize that Canada is a northern climate, and our peak energy demand, particularly as we switch to electrical energy, is going to be in the winter when our heat pumps aren't going to be functioning as well. So the truth is that the envelope part of passive house, I think, is very important if we're going to truly match our energy use to our energy generation. And I think that's one of the key pieces, and passive house does try to deal with that with, you know, the way they multiply energy, right? If you use it in the summer, it's, you know, for cooling or something, it's sort of a multiplied by 1, but you use in the winter for heating, it's 1.5 or 1.7, just depends on what part of the country you're in.
Right.
So the idea that we really need to be designing our buildings to match the energy generation that's available in our location. And that's
Okay.
something I've been pushing a little bit. I don't think we have enough knowledge here in BC of when our peak energy is, and, you know, is solar the right thing to do for BC's grid, or you know, and can we store it? And, you know, there's a bunch of questions there that I think we need to answer. Yeah.
Well, we're running out of time, Scott. This 20 minutes has flown by. So do you have any final thoughts, any final advice you can give any of the architects who may be tuned in today, who are interested, they're intrigued by passive house? Any final words?
Well, start with a compact form. Meet with the municipality and see if you can negotiate some incentives for you and your client. Typically, you can get a little floor area, or you might be able to get some additional units. We have a project marketing here right now where we got from 52 townhouses, or 50 townhouses to 52, if we said we do passive house. And we got some exemptions for the thick walls from the floor space calculations. So that's something that's important, and municipalities are up for giving incentives because they recognize that this is something that they can help with. You got to start with a design pH energy model. Just make sure you're thinking that way. And we've made that mistake, not done it, had crazy compact forms, or been asked to retrofit a design we already had done because, hey, Vancouver's offering a 5% density bonus if I do passive house. Can you change my building for me? That was complicated. It still is. Actually, we're in the middle of that one. Make sure you think out your thermal bridging details. Allow for thick walls. Allow for things like larger doors. Remember, a passive house door is thicker. When it swings, you don't get the same clear opening. It's got a heavier frame. So where you might have 3'4", you might need 3'8", or, you know, those kind of things. And just buy a few resources and get yourself educated and take the trades training or take one of the passive house courses. That's the key.
Good, good. And I know right across Canada, every municipality is focused on decreasing greenhouse gas emissions and helping the country meet its Paris Accord commitments. So everywhere I go, I'm finding folks in all sizes of municipality very interested in how passive house standards can help them meet their targets. And so you're right. Talk to the municipality as early as you possibly can. You might be able to negotiate a bonus for bringing true passive house to the table. So Scott, I wanted to thank you for being my first guest on our Building Conversations webinar. And we're going to try and do this every week. We've got so many talented people in the passive house community. It's one of the things that has really astonished me, frankly, is that you have people who out in the out in the marketplace are competing for buildings, competing for projects together, but on the Passive House forums and over a beer at a social event, they're solving Passive House problems. They're talking about difficulties and looking for solutions, and they're talking about best practices. So it really is an interesting a group to be working with, and I'm learning a lot and having fun. So I will say goodbye to you now. We'll wrap this up. I've got a few more slides for folks if they would hang on for another minute. But thank you very much, Scott, and we'll talk soon. Take care.
We'll see you over beers tonight with everybody else, because there's a great little, international beer session, 4 o'clock tonight Pacific, whatever it is in your time zone,
Right.
and it's a lot of fun, and it'll be fun tonight.
Scott, before you go, we have a couple of questions that we would just like to ask from people.
Good.
So we've got a question from Stamatina. They would like to know what the role of building materials such as concrete, wood, or steel have to do with Passive House design.
Take it away, Scott.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. Of course, I would start with the first notion is that wood is clearly the easiest material to build within a Passive House because it has great thermal characteristics, which is what Passive House is all about. There is this whole concept of embodied carbon, and quite honestly, it's sort of new to even the thinking of our practice, but it's something that we're starting to consider. And it's a really not a Passive House thing, but it's a layering on of another set of ideas that you should be considering as you do a Passive House. So you might want to think about the type of material you're using for your insulation. If you're using steel, the key is making sure you have connections that when you go inside outside the thermal envelope, you have a thermally broken connection. And with concrete, nowadays we're saying let's try to minimize the amount of concrete we use, but it's a very, very important material in construction. So you use it, but use it judiciously.
Great. We have a question from Alan. The question is, how easy is it for an architect firm to use the Passive House computer package?
So it's a giant Excel package, and it does take some expertise to learn how to use it. But what you will find is if you get a certifier involved, they're usually pretty helpful on your first round through the use of the software. We do our energy modeling in-house, but in the last couple projects we're now working with mechanical engineers who have some expertise in the Passive House planning package as well. And we're looking now to trade the energy model back and forth. So we're going to put the envelope in, the part that the architect is responsible for. Then we're going to ship it to our mechanical firm who are going to put in the basic parameters that'll be part of the mechanical systems, pretty much the hot water and the heating and ventilation system. And then we'll get that model back, and then we'll collaborate to just see how we can optimize it. But that's useful, and I really do encourage architects to do it in-house, particularly with the design pH input piece, because it is fairly interactive and much more intuitive for architects than other ways of doing things.
Another question was, have you considered thermal mass?
Thermal mass is considered within the planning house package. There is a couple of items that you can select, but what you will find is that in a Passive House, thermal mass is a little less important than it might be in another building type. It doesn't affect your energy use that much, but it just retards it a little bit. And it is taken into effect in the algorithms. Mind you, I'm not the scientist that wrote them, so I don't really know how the effect is.
Okay, and we have another question from Dennis. Are maintenance concepts provided to maintain their efficiency of a Passive House designed project?
Well, I would say that we have, in our buildings, we have always tried to create a bit of a user manual, and I think we could do better, particularly on the mechanical systems, and particularly if you're in a remote climate where, a place where there isn't a lot of expertise. So that is the key. If you can keep the simple systems and they're simple to maintain, that will always be a better way to go. And we all know that mechanical systems they have to be commissioned when you first put your building together, and that's part of the Passive House standard, which makes it important, right? You commission your ventilation system, you test it, you commission your building envelope with an air tightness test, you test it, you then commission your hot water system and everything else. But they don't always work exactly as you hoped. And you should really try to monitor them for a year or two. I think that's so important as we go. And then in the future, you know, all you could really do is monitor the energy use of the building. And if it gets out of whack, you know that there's something that needs to be looked at again.
Great. I think that's all the time we have now. If your question does not get answered during this webinar, please submit. Oh, we have one more. We'll just answer one more and then we'll be finished. In the MERB you completed in Vancouver, about how much was the construction cost surcharge over standard code?
So I get asked that question a lot, and I can tell you that we actually built it cheaper than a lot of other people were building at the time. But part of that was it was very compact building. You know, it does have brick on the exterior. It has reasonable finishes. It has, you know, as good, you know, countertops and everything interior as a typical condo building would have had. And part of it was that just there's been so much inflation in our local marketplace that it's really, really hard to get to that number. But we do think that it's not a huge premium. You know, we're talking maybe 5%. And, you know, we have a project just in marketing right now where they've sold 20 of 52 townhouses in the even through this COVID crisis. They started marketing, actually, it was originally supposed to be in the fall, but they delayed it to the spring, and it's been quite successful. So, and you know, the buyers did acknowledge the Passive House. I don't think it's the reason they chose the project entirely, but you know, the first buyer opted for the solar package that went on the roof, and so you know, there's some interest in the environment as part of these projects for sure.
Good.
Great. Well, thank you. That's all the time we have. So again, if your question doesn't get answered, please submit it to us at info@Passive House Canada, and we'll make sure we get those questions answered by either Chris or Scott.
Very good. Well, thank you. Thanks again, Scott. We will see you at the next social, the social tonight. You can find information at passivehouseaccelerator.com. It's a really cool newsletter, and they have information about how folks can log in and crack a cool one or whatever later on tonight. So I'll say goodbye. I've got a couple of slides left, and we'll carry on. Thank you. So a little bit, if I may, about Passive House Canada. As I said, Scott is currently a director. He's has been chair of our board. Our mission is to make the international Passive House standard of building performance understood, achievable, and adopted by government, industry professionals, building suppliers, and consumers right across Canada. And we're doing this through education, advocacy, national and local events, and building projects. How we do this through education is really important. And I wanted to take a second to tell you about our education. You heard Scott talk about the need to become educated. Passive House Canada has the clearest pathway to certification. We've been teaching how to do this for many, many years. And so we've got the courses, and the courses are online. It is the gold standard of net zero high performance building certification. It's the most direct way through our bundled series, our 120 series, the bundled series called Pathway to Certification. It's two big courses, A and B. C is prep for the exam. And these are perfect courses for architects, engineers, and other building professionals. Those people who see a Passive House certification as something that will be very good for their career, very good for their business. And just to put a plug in, Passive House Canada members receive a 30% off the regular price for this bundle, the 120 series ABC, 30% off for members. And right now, because I know the environmental or the economic environment that we're in right now, we're telling folks that if they want to take any of our classes, that if they can make a 50% down payment at this time, and we'll give them 45 days to come up with the second part of the payment. That's a way I think of us reaching out and acknowledging that that for some cash flow is a bit of a problem right now, but at the same time, people want to future-proof their careers. But wait, we have more courses. We have an introduction to Passive House, which is an overview, more in depth than what we went through today. We have courses, trades courses. One of the things that I wanted to touch on, but we ran out of time, is that you can have the best design, the best energy modeling, the best windows and doors, etc., etc. But if you don't have the right people building the building for you, it can be very difficult and slow the process down. And we're finding that tradespeople are really enjoying learning about Passive House standards and building to those high quality standards. For many, they've wanted to build to that quality all their life, or they've been involved in quality building, and now they can put a certification to it. We have trades courses both online and perhaps by the fall we'll be doing them in class again. But the final part will be a hands-on training session with our trades courses. So we would also be remiss if we didn't talk about Passive House membership. And I mentioned earlier on that a membership supports our advocacy on your behalf. We're the ones talking to government about incorporating Passive House standards into municipal, provincial, federal legislation. You will save money on our excellent education programs. If you are looking for professional development credits, there's a lot of the things we have online that you can that you pay for, a modest sum that go towards professional development credits. If you're a member, you get those for less. I think this is the most important thing, is you become part of a very passionate Passive House family. And as Scott and I were saying, that we find there's a lot of online sharing and in-person sharing. Folks are bringing their problems to the forum and having the community help them solve it. Even people who would be their competitor in the marketplace, when we're online or when we're at a Passive House event, we're all kindred spirit. You'll enjoy our socials, of course. We also have a place where you can post your profile once you're certified, and receive notification about some pretty important RFPs online from government. And the directory allows prospective clients and even collaborators in the Passive House world to find you when you're in our directory. So one final note, and I'll let you go. Our national conference takes place this coming November in Victoria, BC. I'm going to be very optimistic and say by then, COVID-19 will be but a ragged memory. Come enjoy a beautiful setting in the Delta Hotel right on the waterfront, and enjoy Victoria's wonderful weather. You can find details on our website, www.passivehousecanada.com. So there we are. I wanted to thank everybody for your time and attention today, and to let you know we'll be doing this again next week. And next week's guest is Maureen Sanchez. Maureen is an engineer, a Passive House specialist and certifier. She works with RDH Building Science. She's worked internationally. She's worked across Canada. She has some fantastic projects in her portfolio. She spent many years learning the Passive House way in London, England, and she will no doubt share some of those stories with us. Maureen taught me my introduction to Passive House was with her, and a very passionate and well-spoken person she is. So I look forward to welcoming Maureen to next week's building conversations, and we'll leave it there for now. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. If you have questions, please email them to us and we will do our best to answer them all. Please check out our website, check out our course offerings. This is a rare opportunity, I think, when so many things in our lives have been paused, for us to learn a new skill. I will leave it there for now. Thank you, one and all. We'll see you next week.